to Doughty Street.
Thank you
It's
so much.
great to have you as our new associate. You've just retired, I think is the word, or ended your term as the UN's Human Rights Commissioner. 4 years embroiled in the struggles leading the UN's human rights. And we know you as the man who put together, the architect, in effect, of the International Criminal Court. Wearing your diplomatic hat, you chaired all those interminable meetings that went on before the ICC was brought together in, what was it, 1998? And amazingly got enough ratifications to start in 2002. And here we are, meeting in a week where, gosh, Brazil has some sort of fascist as its leader who would not have been elected had the Human Rights Committee directive to Brazil to allow Lula to stand. He was way ahead of him in the opinion polls. But its judges said it's not binding, so go away, Human Rights Committee. We have in Sri Lanka a genocidaire seems back in control, who will probably be in prison if the UN Human Rights Council recommendations of a war crimes court had been taken up. We don't seem to be any closer to getting justice for the Rohingya, despite the naming by the Commission of the generals who were responsible. Once upon a time, in 2016, you warned that the election of Donald Trump would be a danger to the world, and we now have the world, the international rules-based order being torn up. Paris, climate change, the Iran deal, and now the attack determined to destroy the International Criminal Court. John Bolton, echoed by President Trump in his speech in September to the UN, talks of arresting its judges, putting them in prison if they dare come to America to a UN conference, if they continue with the investigation into American death squads in Afghanistan. So, with that state of the world, I can go on and say words that I've read. The overwhelming question, don't you despair?
Undoubtedly, yes. And for two reasons. One is the complete mediocrity in public officialdom around the world. I visited 43 countries during my term as High Commissioner. And in an overwhelming number of cases, I met the chief executive of the state, the president, the prime minister, and then the senior officials. And almost in all cases, I was unimpressed by what it is I heard and what it is that I saw. Leaderships that were fundamentally not interested in the welfare of their people. Leaderships more interested in serving a particular clique, a particular group, we call them the elites that have captured the state, to the detriment of the rest of the population. And when you add to this mix, then those who have deliberate agendas, very short-sighted goals, and I'm prepared to use discredited means that were abandoned after the end of the Second World War, because the wreckage of humanity was there for everyone to see. The consequences of these sorts of instruments of policy having been used to destructive effect. Pick them up. It's hardly surprising that we're in the space that we're in. And what was always troubling for us is that when we saw a gross violation, aside from the local and often very brave human rights defenders, and then civil society sort of on a broader scale, we would rarely hear denunciation from major capitals around the world or from public figures outside of that community of civil society. So it's a failure of courage on a massive scale, and we have the capacity for self-annihilation. We all know that. We know that just as we've created this marvel called the internet, we can destroy it. We know, and we don't know, but we suspect that the next cyber war will be difficult to contain and could lead to a kinetic war. We don't have the means to now resolve conflicts of a conventional nature, so let alone something of a hybrid nature and much more complex. So there's a crying need now to mobilize a different set of actors, because what we have before us is singularly unimpressive. And just to speak to your issue of frustration, I may have mentioned this before when I was here back in April, but my wife, who was living in New York while I was in Geneva, was concerned about my mental health because I was just so depressed with what it was I was seeing. And so she said to me, look, your 9-year-old daughter and I are completely engrossed in this latest series of, what was the latest, the Great British Bake Off. So she said, if you're feeling so low, log on to the internet and watch one of these episodes, and you'll feel better, and tomorrow we'll discuss it. So here I was, 11 o'clock at night, sitting in a small flat in Geneva, and I got on and I was watching this show, and I was completely mesmerized. And this poor fellow pulled out a souffle right ahead, like a few seconds to spare, and they were counting down, and it was all frantic. And he pulls the souffle out and it collapsed, and I burst into tears. And I couldn't stop for about an hour. So I realized that you can despair.
Well, that may be comfort food, but what are we to do with the fact that the people you identify, the authoritarian leaders, those who are concerned only with their own power and wealth, are generally popular? They are people elected or supported by populations that seem to be in some way driven by fear, whether it's fear of the column from Honduras that will deliver to Trump the midterms, or fear of those crossing the Mediterranean, which seem to play a part in Brexit things, Orban in Hungary, thriving on fear of the refugee.
But do you remember, Geoffrey, and I think you wrote about this actually, the discussion between Gustav Gilbert and Hermann Goering, and how Goering, very simple and rather crude fashion, explained how the method works. I mean, he explained it to Gilbert. You can move any society, and it's relatively simple. You tell them they are under threat. There is a natural fear in any case, and then you just, of course, spice it up, and you can bend your people to your will in almost any circumstance, because Gilbert challenged him and said, yes, but in democratic societies, surely it can't work. And Hermann Goering was absolutely positive that it is a successful and proven way to win popular support. And of course, when you go back and to the modern antecedents and just look at the example of Karl Weger in Vienna in the 1890s, he was the mayor who, took anti-Semitism and was speaking in the shadow of this appalling attack in Pittsburgh only days ago. He took an anti-Semitism which was alive and kicking in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he turned it into an even more virulent hatred of the Austrian and Hungarian Jewry. And there was this episode where they were planning to move a number of Romanian Jews to Vienna, and he blocked it, and his popularity soared. And it was rather dramatic because he had Jewish friends himself and was asked this question, well, can't you reconcile the two? I mean, you have Jewish friends and yet you're so, determined to attack them at every turn. And he could easily partition the two because one was a very successful method at garnering votes and popular support. And so it's not it drives me mad when I see, various accounts of Orban or Trump, and then somehow they're political geniuses. No, they're not. They just went into an area which we had believed was forbidden in the practice of the exercise of political power. That it was already proven where this leads, and once you drive the chauvinistic nationalism to a particular point, unless there's a conflict that accrues, how on earth do you wind it down? How do you tell people after a while that actually we were mistaken, so sorry, you're just like everyone else, you're no better, no more deserving of this category of rights than the poor immigrant family living next to you. So they put us on this perilous course. And there's relative silence, across the European Union. Whenever the odd politician spoke, we had the foreign minister of Luxembourg, Jean Asselborn, who spoke out on one occasion about Orban's conduct. No one else came to support from the European Union. And so we have this generation of feckless, weak politicians. And the other thing, Geoffrey, it's just in complete contrast to your style. The other day I saw a former Prime Minister being interviewed, and he said all the right things. But why couldn't he say them when he was Prime Minister? They all say they become wise and courageous once they leave office. It's really desperately sad.
Well, this is, of course, the product of diplomatic language, of Chatham House rules, and things like that. But I think there is a genuine confusion as to how we respond. There is a Democratic candidate at the moment who's gone on the offensive and using demagogic language. That surely is not the way forward. The long way forward, I suppose, is human rights education for a new generation, for a younger generation, in the hope that they will be more attuned to the values that Trump and Orban defy. What hope do you see there? I know you've been involved in trying to get the UN to set up education.
But I'm not sure that the proposition that if you engage in a brawl, it only serves them. Because we have too few examples of that actually happening. We don't know. When we decided to counterpunch with Orban, he said something horrific, and we then responded. He was addressing a group of local officials and said, I don't want our people to mix with people of another color. And he said it openly, and we took the English translation from his website. So it wasn't in any fashion sort of language that had been modified through translation. And so we attacked him, and then he counter-attacked. He basically said that I should resign, and he complained to the Secretary General and to member states that I was completely unhinged and so forth. The sort of thing that you would hear yourself.
Yes.
And then we decided to go back, and so we attacked him again. And this time we attacked him in more detail. And Hungary is a country of 10 million people. The numbers of Afro-Hungarians living in the country are no more than about 1,300 individuals in a country of 10 million, with a Middle Eastern population that is statistically insignificant. So, and 70% of the population is estimated to be xenophobic, and it's about right when you look at the results that Fidesz has managed to secure for itself. And so, there you have it. We attacked him, he counter-attacked, we attacked him again, And then the very next day, there was an occasion for them to again attack us, and they dropped it. They dropped it. And they didn't say anything. So I'm not sure that when people say, well, if you really engage with them, it's a losing battle because it only wins them, because not enough people are actually doing it for us to surmise that that's the case. If you had 5 or 6 strong, leaders of government who took these people on, maybe, and then we see that it doesn't really work, well then we can say there's enough empirical evidence.
You said Duterte needed psychiatric examination, which is obviously true. But when you went further and when you called Trump a demagogue, it was wonderfully ironic that the country that accused you of overreaching was Russia.
Yeah.
Seriously, Russia accused Zeid of, what did they say? We're over...
They've said many things.
Yeah. No doubt Robert Mueller will be looking at this incident. But
apparently, I don't know if you saw this last week, Duterte, in a press conference, said that I upset him so much that I made him cry by pointing out that he had murdered thousands of people. In fact, it was too much for him to bear the fact that I said that he needed evaluation. But there's a little postscript to this as well, and that is that I was approached by the Special Rapporteur on Persons with Disability because they didn't want any association with, and I was rightly putting my place on that.
But it clearly is one way to get people out in Britain has been, we had someone killed a few years ago by a Polonian, an assassination directed from Russia, probably from Putin. Neither Gordon Brown nor David Cameron said a word virtually. Of course, the Skripal attempted assassination has at least made them more critical. But still, language as such from all countries have been mocked, and we now have the Khashoggi assassination, which has made leaders wary of attacking the Crown Prince, or your colleague as a one Crown Prince to another. What would you say? Should we put? He's obviously not going to. There's not going to be any justice in Turkey because there won't be a surrender. There won't be any justice in Saudi because they'll put a couple of scapegoats up, no doubt, and execute them or put them in prison. But an international court on the Lebanon model, perhaps, is the only way that the lockery model would work. But any chance of that?
Well, I think on the Khashoggi case, there are some interesting features of it. One is the sustained press attention given to it. I think I've never seen a story run for 2 weeks in the way that it ran. So clearly it was an emblematic case. It was seen as sort of rather pivotal, as if the Rubicon had been crossed, and as Robert Kagan was saying, welcome to the jungle. And this is the first, series of Bushes that were the complete breakdown. If a consular facility can be used as a slaughterhouse for dissidents, this is, and there's no pushback. We saw this, of course, last year with the Rohingya crisis as well. That not only was it just horrific what was happening to the Rohingya going back to 2012 onward, and even before that, but the fact that there was no penalty paid by the authorities in Naypyidaw made me think of the Abyssinia example and Mussolini in 1935, because while a 3-country panel had been set up to look at that particular case, Mussolini had absolutely no intention of withdrawing from Abyssinia, and it was clear. And then of course, after the Manchurian crisis, in Berlin they were taking note. And so we began to think, well, if this is the case with the Rohingya, then this was the last of a series of, defaults by the international community not making good on its obligations. where are we going with all of this? And so obviously the Khashoggi case, was seen in different light by the press, and then the sustained attention was remarkable. And of course, being fed by the Turkish leaks. The question that emerged, and this is a friend who raised this, and all of us began to chat online about it, was that if the Turks had evidence, and the Consul General was entitled to functional immunity only, and the Saudis were not going to say that this was an action ordered by the state, then why didn't they move to at least detain him for questioning? And while the premises may be inviolable to a certain extent, we don't know exactly how they were eavesdropping, sort of whether it was done electronically from without or whether they had devices from within.
Contrary to the Vienna Convention, but then no one has ever taken that convention seriously. Burgling and bugging their way around London was the boast of MI5.
I mean, I had extraordinary meetings where, exactly like that, where a senior official of a country would be telling us how they have surveillance on every single major to the human rights person, which was amazing. I obviously didn't really know who they were talking to because I went public right away. So the way that the Turks were manipulating this, I mean, clearly absolutely ghoulish and macabre killing. I made everyone in the human rights community agree with the proposition that there had to be an international investigation at the very least, if we were going to believe or whatever, or discover the truth about this. So obviously, if you have an international investigation, then you'd have to convert it, if it's a human rights-based investigation, into a criminal investigation. And ultimately, yes, I mean, there is no doubt that something terrible happened, and a body presumably is down in pieces in a well that needs to be accessed. The fact that it's now been displaced by the letter bombs that were distributed in the United States, the attack on two African American individuals in Kentucky, and then this horrific attack on the synagogue, gives one the impression that maybe a deal has been struck and that this will slowly sort of just disappear. But my sense is that the community or the media won't allow it to disappear.
Well, at least the media were onto that. I mean, when I was acting for Lula this year and succeeded in the Human Rights Committee, it struck me this was an amazing success in the sense that interim measures are only used to stop execution. So it was the first time the tribunal had taken the bill, but there was just no mention in the media of this extraordinary thing which threatened the possibility that Bolsonaro would not win the election, and it was ignored. And the other problem, I suppose, as well as the lack of media interest, is the whole axiom of the Security Council. I mean, I still remember with sort of pathos those demonstrators in 2011 in Damascus holding up big banners, Assad to the Hague. It was as though we had many expectations. They were shot. 4 years later, 400,000 of them had been killed after others got into the act. They were peaceful protesters. And the Security Council just poleaxed. You cannot get anything through that is, when the veto was threatened by China or Russia or America. The General Assembly, I think, did something the Yazidis, didn't it? It set up an investigation, but
accountability mechanism.
It lacks the Chapter 7 powers.
Well, I mean, the main challenge is what do we do with a number now of leaders, some of them democratically elected, but when it comes to the human rights perspective, leave us almost breathless at their shamelessness. They just feel no shame. And part of what it is that we need is for them to at least sense that there is something they're doing that causes embarrassment to them and their people. And when they don't feel it, then how do we sort of exert pressure on them? They couldn't care less whether you have a particular mechanism or you have special procedures or you have a decision by the working group on arbitrary detention, you have pressure by the Inter-America Commission, that they just brush it to one side. And I'm not sure the answer is clear to me. But again, I suspect it's because we're not putting enough pressure, as opposed to feeling that it's just not working and we should try and think of something radically different.
Well, and what is clearly not enough? There are laws. We should make common cause with diplomats and NGOs and the media.
Well, I think, obviously this is an area also that is not well tested. When you look at the social movements that are potent forces within a number of different countries, seldom are they all well connected and joined up with other social movements elsewhere. And then we never see, for instance in New York, if you have a Pride march, you will find that the LGBTQ or LGBTI community and their friends and followers or supporters take part in these marches. We do as well. But you don't find the women's rights movement behind them, or the civil rights movement behind them, the rights of persons with disabilities behind them. And this is the sort of fundamental weakness within the global human rights movement. It's too partitioned, too cellular, and it's not well joined up. What would it mean in a world of 7.6 million people, I think we are now, a billion people. If we were to have 100 million people out on the streets of many countries saying this is not good enough, what we see in terms of governance is not good enough, where are the social and legal protections that are enshrined in our constitutions or the statutes? Why are you not basically doing your job? And if there isn't this sort of pressure from one side, it comes from the other. And then you have the demagoguery, of course, making hay from the anxieties of people who feel marginalized and feel left out.
I was at an event at SOAS last night where you were part of the elders, which is a ridiculous name. You're not old. And my generation learned not to trust. I don't trust people over 30. It was the catch cry in the 60s, but it gives the sense that you're a lot of old tolerers. But at the event, people were asked what is the main threat to human rights, and it was interesting, they didn't say Donald Trump, which I thought was obvious. They didn't say climate change, even though Mary Robinson was there. They said inequality. And of course, Samuel Moyne and the Yale School is at the moment criticizing the human rights movement for ignoring inequality and social justice. What would your answer be?
It's difficult for me to reconcile my own experiences with what Samuel says, because in every meeting I had with a head of state or head of government, these issues were brought up, and to suggest that we not sort of try to point to them, because all of it deals with, when we deal with matters of social injustice, it goes back down to this problem. There are three things that must be satisfied if you're going to see good governance. You have to see countries that essentially are free of discrimination, and there are no countries with a pristine record in respect of that. And then countries free of deprivation on the back of the discrimination that we see, structural discrimination. And then ultimately countries where fear is not being peddled, not present, and where people feel that they can exercise their rights without concern or worry about being arrested arbitrarily and denied their rights to a fair trial and so forth. And in many countries it just doesn't exist. And you have, again, elite capture. A certain part of the country benefits enormously from certain well-tuned policies. And you have many people dispossessed. And one meets with them all the time. The pressure on the human rights movement, Geoffrey, and I think you would agree, doesn't really come from these countries that try and attack the human rights movement. And you have this category of leaders that are abomination when it comes to human rights. The real pressure comes from the victims themselves. You go to an IDP camp, sitting with a community that has no access to anything, and for years, and yet only a few miles away in the capital city, all the services are present. And it's simply because these people are of a different ethnicity, a different tribe, a different color, whatever it may be. And so we've always been raising these issues. And I think the problem is, and this is the concern I have, and it can be resolved, the problem is that when you have well-intentioned criticisms on the part of academia and by scholars who want to make a contribution, by pointing out the lacuna, pointing out the shortcomings, the fact that we stick to legal jargon, make ourselves unintelligible to a normal human being. All of this is true. But what I worry about is that authoritarian governments in particular seize on this and then they throw it back in our face. Well, you don't even have the support of the academic community. I mean, it's not just us, country X saying this. Look at these scholarly publications, and you can see for yourself that you are yourselves, delinquent and incapable of promoting this agenda. And so we need to find a sort of some formula where there is scholarship, but it's not sort of manipulated. And the people who ultimately pay the price are the human rights defenders who are punished for exercising their right to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and so forth. Perhaps they need to preface whatever they're writing by saying that they are supporters of the human rights agenda, but find fault with the way in which some of it is practiced on
the Yale School is particularly problematic at the moment because they're seized upon by others. Well, I want to ask you a personal question, if you don't mind. Here you are, a crown prince.
We keep saying this.
I rely on Wikipedia, so it's probably wrong. But they've got a whole family tree, or I should like to say. But you go to American University, you get a doctorate from Cambridge in history. You then go back and become an officer in the Jordanian Desert Police. And I have a mental picture of you riding a camel through the desert with something like that on your arm, yes, and then become an ambassador for your country. But and then you turn your back on power and palaces, as we think, and become embroiled in the human rights problems of the world. What made you cheat? What determined you to take that course?
A combination of things. In life, it always is sort of a combination of incidental occurrences and then some sort of evaluation that you make on the back of it. I sort of fell into the UN. It was a flight that left New York at 11 o'clock, very late, and I had hours to kill, so I called up a Haitian friend of mine at the UN, and he said to me, how are you enjoying the desert police? And I said, I didn't really enjoy it. There was no one to police in the desert. So he said, well, they're recruiting for the former Yugoslavia. So why don't you apply and go? And that's what I did.
Mm-hmm.
And
this was the tribunal? Or the...
No, this was working for Amplifor as a civil peacekeeper. And I think that experience for all of us was traumatic because we clearly could see what was happening.
Were you in Sarajevo?
Not in the beginning. I was more in Croatia, and then at the end in 1995, yes. And then But you could see that there was an aggressive war being fought. You could see that while the politics of the former Yugoslavia were quite complicated, from a moral point of view, it was very clear that there was a principal aggressor and there was a principal victim, and that there was no moral equivalency in terms of what all the sides were doing to one another. And I think all of us came out of that quite scarred. And I often refer to two experiences. One, we were coming back from Pali, we were negotiating a ceasefire between the Bosnian government and the Bosnian Serb leadership. And alongside us, as we were winding our way back to Sarajevo, a well-known war criminal drove up and had the skull of a child on the car with a helmet. And we'd seen how children were being targeted by snipers in Sarajevo. And there was just something just so evil, and lawyers perhaps don't like to use these terms, but so evil about what was happening there. And then there was this, I was part of the UN team. We had a meeting with the German foreign minister in the ancient city of Gotha. And so we had to fly up to meet her Kinkel, and we were supposed to land in Erfurt. And Erfurt was covered by fog, and the pilot was told to fly on to Weimar and to circle until we could land at Erfurt. So we flew over Weimar, and we were circling over the city, over the town, and you look down and you could, I'd never been there in person, but of course you associate it with German Enlightenment, Goethe, Herder, Schiller, and then as this aircraft was doing its turn, as you moved to the south of the town, you look north, there was a sort of perimeter of a cloud bank, low cloud bank, that basically hugged the contours of the hill of the rising that was Buchenwald. And then, so quite obviously to people like us serving in the former Yugoslavia, you felt no matter what the achievements that human beings were able to accomplish, every now and then we had to deal with the utter bestiality of humankind. And how we could never celebrate our success eventually if we're constantly having to confront that part. And I think for us coming out of the former Yugoslavia, at least all my friends, I don't have a single one who didn't feel as strongly, or didn't feel strongly as I did, that we needed to somehow do something. And then there was this negotiation on an international criminal court, and an uncle of mine was invited to attend. And he called me up and he said, look, I need you to go to my place, I can't go. And the more I protested, the more he insisted. So I realized it was a hopeless trying to argue. So I went, and to my horror, and he didn't tell me this, he was supposed to be chairing the thing. So utterly clueless about what the statute was, the draft statute that had come to us from the ILC. And there I was trying to somehow cover for the fact that I was completely ignorant.
Well, you weren't a lawyer?
I wasn't a lawyer, no.
So that you fell into it?
I fell into it, but also it gave me an opportunity, and I think a generation of diplomats, to learn from Philippe Kirsch, who at that time had presided over a number of treaty body discussions. And he was particularly skilled at arriving at a consensus, or creating consensus out of 189 delegations at the time, and all these lawyers who couldn't agree on a single draft provision. And then you learned that there was enormous technique, and not everyone can do it. And certainly if you didn't know the techniques, you couldn't do it. But there's a technique to developing consensus. And in one way, this is the danger, that the technique was employed to develop consensus on the Rome Statute. And there were some really interesting things that happened in Rome, which gave us the impression that we had complete political backing for the enterprise. And clearly, all the weaknesses you have cited just reveal the fact that the understructure was not as strong as we thought it was going to be.
Because consensus can lead to the lowest common denominator, which can also be a problem. But we've talked enough about the weaknesses and the problems. What still gives you optimism?
I mean, it's these amazing human rights defenders, Geoffrey. I mean, you just leave you astonished at their courage. Berta Cáceres' daughter came to see me, and 22 years old. I mean, she looked very young, and she, and as some of you, many of you would recall, her mother was murdered because she was leading protests against the Zeid Raad Dam being built in a part of Honduras where the rights of the indigenous community were just being run roughshod. And so she was murdered, and her daughter came to see us. And she looked very slight, slender, like any undergraduate from any university. And when she began to speak, she was high-grade steel inside. And knowing the risks, and yet still willing to take them on. I mean, in normal life you don't see this. I mean, look at all the politicians we have to deal with on a daily basis, self-serving. I mean, never thinking, the thought of resigning for some scandal never exists. And yet these people at a grassroots level are just astonishing. This young fellow came to see me from Nicaragua, one of the student leaders, again about 20 years old. And now I think he's still detained, and God only knows what's happening to him. And I said to him, are you planning to go straight back to Managua? And he said, yes. And I said, but you can stay outside the country for a little while until it calms down. No, he wanted to go back. And so I think that makes us feel that there's hope. If only, though, these are the sorts of people that are leading nations, as opposed to what we see.
One day, perhaps there will be. Well, I'll just throw it open now. We don't need microphones, I think, but any questions? Yes, Steve.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. May I echo Geoffrey's very warm welcome to you to Doughty Street Chambers. We're so privileged to have such a genuine and committed human rights defender join us here at these chambers. I wanted to ask, if I may, about the International Criminal Court, especially given your pivotal role in setting it up and establishing it. In the sort of 15 years or so of the court's operation, one of the criticisms of it is that it's far too Africa-focused. But now we're at the brink of the court possibly focusing its attention on the USA, Russia, and potentially Israel. Do you think those kind of cases will help or hinder the court in its ongoing work?
Yeah. No, I think, of course, it would help. I mean, let me just, you have to look at the general context here. When you look at the multilateral system where the UN is concerned, and you obviously we focus on New York because that's where the Security Council is, that's where the Permanent Five exercise that power in the most visible form, and the General Assembly exists as well. And you look at the agenda of the UN Security Council, and I served on it, and I think there are 84 agenda items, practically almost all of them are devoted to Africa. And then you look at the work of the UN. Well, you have humanitarian work, most of it in Africa. You have peace and security, most of the peacekeeping operations in Africa. I mean, if you look at South America, it's amazing that you have a conflict that lasted for 50 years, but never fell under the agenda of the Security Council, in Colombia, for example, right? Or you could make the argument of Mexico. Why wasn't Mexico ever under the agenda of the Security Council? If it had been an African country, it would have been, right? So you look at the practice of the UN, and in one way, it's sort of that way of thinking has leached to the International Criminal Court in part. And I have to be careful here, because we know that there were state referrals in the beginning. But why were some of the preliminary investigations not taken further. It's not something I'm privy to, but at least the suspicion is that there was political pressure exercised, and they were cautious. From the human rights perspective, at least when I was High Commissioner, I made a point of not showing any favor, or not treating any country different simply because of its size or its relative political power. The interesting thing is that in one way, holding up the mirror to the P5 was easier than doing it to the aspirant countries, the BRICS countries, the regional powers. And in the UN, there was a set of countries that it was felt could intimidate and silence critics. Cuba, which is not a major country but politically important, Venezuela, you have Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia to a certain extent, India, Pakistan, and Brazil as well. And we made a point that we would comment on all those countries. And once you break through that, it actually becomes easier for you. Because then you're not seen to be playing political. And I think maybe the court, I wasn't in the office of the prosecutor, so I don't know exactly what has happened, but the impression is that some of these earlier investigations could have gone further, and they desisted from taking it further. And that's sort of, in one way, they trapped themselves. But I also feel that it's the only court of its kind. If we don't have it, we go back to the ad hoc arrangements, or we have to depend on universal jurisdiction. And there we can make gains, obviously, but it needs a strong political leadership, and that's variable. So we have to, much as we can be frustrated with the court, we have to redouble our efforts to try and strengthen it. My wife keeps saying to me, why don't you go back, read law, do the conversion course, and put yourself up to be a judge of the court? It would look odd on my application if I were to say something like that.
Well, we'll be happy to coach you through the exam. Other questions, Kirsty?
Hi, apologies, I missed the first part, but as you just mentioned Colombia, I'd just like to ask you a question about the peace process. So, as you know, that was eventually signed after 52 years of conflict. But then there's been a big issue politically within Colombia with the election of Duque. And do you consider that political figure could actually destabilise the peace accord that was agreed? Or do you think there is still some hope that it will remain stable?
I'll be on stage with Santos next week in Paris, and I'm interviewing him, so I'll be asking him the same question. Look, I think in the minds of many, it would seem that the agreement is now dead. The numbers of ex-FARC leaders, or let's say, not leaders, but members who have been killed now has risen, I think, to about 89. And so it looks very unlikely that it can be rescued at this point. And Uribe, even in Cartagena, as the agreement was signed, was demonstrating just outside the venue site where everyone had gathered for the signing ceremony. And so it was clear that if the election went his way, it was going to be an uphill battle to sort of maintain the integrity of the agreement. So I think we were worried. These people, many of the members, not the senior leadership, but the others will go back to what it is they know best. And I think we all feel that the fighting is going to resume. But there is something else. It goes back to this deep discrimination that exists, in respect of the campesinos and in respect of the Afro-Colombians. I went to the department of Choco, to the town of Quibdó, and we took a boat ride up this river. It was straight out of 007, I mean, into the areas where the illegal groups, or let's say the armed groups, were doing illegal gold mining. And it was really the ELN and its offshoots that were there. And as we were photographing these people who were doing the mining, they were all covering their faces. The interesting thing is that the military were basically around, had encircled the area, and you couldn't get the equipment to do the mining unless you had gone through with these military checkpoints. And so it was fairly obvious that the military seemed to be on the take, that you had a combination of armed groups plus state actors, local state actors, and they were all in on this together. And then the villages on the banks of the river, you saw these children just diving into the water, filled with nitrous oxide and mercury. And someone said to us that the levels of mercury in the blood was just astronomical. And this is a department you felt largely ignored, and they're not just this, but Amazon. I mean, there are many that you can cite. And you in Bogota, it feels like you're in the OECD. And so it's an extraordinary situation. And until you resolve these issues of discrimination, perhaps the most profound question ever posed to me was when I was at a school outside of Geneva about a year ago, and a 13 or 14-year-old girl said to me, "Why do we discriminate, High Commissioner? Why do we do this? Explain to us, you're the adult. We don't understand it. You tell us why." Not easy to respond to simply. But that's the same.
Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much. I have so many questions, but I'm going to stick to one about the High Commissioner, the Office of the High Commissioner, which is an extraordinary institution, and it's relatively young still, and it has achieved remarkable things. And what always strikes me about it is how under-resourced you are, and how little money there is for you, and how so much of the great work that's done by the Office of the High Commissioner is done by interns or by individuals that then become the charity roles of their committees. And so my question is really, how do we get more resources into the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and whether we shouldn't be making more of a kind of fuss about that. It just strikes me that you do all this remarkable work on nothing, and it's really reliant on goodwill, and how we expose that, and how all the money is in New York and not in Geneva. And so my sort of follow-on question to that is, what do you think your biggest success was as High Commissioner? And in maybe anticipating what you're going to say, I'm going to bring up the UN for an Equal campaign. I hope for you to make a reference to that, which is this extraordinary work that you did around LGBT equality globally, and how that happened, and how was it coming from your own background, which Geoffrey's just described? How have people responded to you personally about having driven that campaign through, and where you see the future of that campaign?
Right. Well, let me answer it back to front. I mean, it's remarkable. It was remarkable to us when we launched the campaign, how we seem to be the only voice in the UN speaking on behalf of the LGBTI community. Ban Ki-moon was vocal as well. He participated in the various events. But beyond us, and it always struck us as being strange that UNICEF was nowhere to be seen. And compared to us, I mean, it's behemoth, and all these resources. And why were they not saying anything when suicide rates among the LGBTI at the level of adolescence was so high in so many countries, when you're beginning to form your own understanding of what sexual identity means and orientation. And so others said to us, well, it's because they don't want to risk, the funding flow, and so they're quite happy to leave it to the Human Rights Office to do all the advocacy. But there is something wrong with that, drastically wrong. And not just UNICEF, I mean, others as well, UN Women could be speaking about this. So, I mean, they obviously the funding streams were open for them when it comes to humanitarian action. And no, I was always uncomfortable with this. There was something else, and I complained bitterly in some of the meetings that when we take the situation in Yemen, the humanitarian actors do an incredibly important job there, and they will highlight the suffering of the Yemeni people. But to me it seemed akin to a patient being brought into an emergency ward in a hospital, and the humanitarians are making sure that there's enough plasma that is hooked up to the drips, that trying to stabilize the condition. And it was, from our part, our job was to ward off the assailant who still had the dagger in the heart of the patient being dragged in, and we were putting pressure on the other side. But I so often felt that I couldn't do it alone. And in these meetings with other officials, I would say, I cannot be the only one to be talking about this. And then someone would say to me, well, you know, for us it's complicated, donors and I don't know what. Well, I have the same donors. We have the same funding stream. I don't know what it is in the end, but my sense is that people can either do it or they can't. They can either speak out or they can't. And if they can't, they come up with any number of excuses why they can't do it. And I think for us who are not in the front lines, the human rights defenders are in the front lines, and we see their amazing bravery, we feel compelled to speak on their behalf. But there are others that are still waiting in silence, and I understand humanitarian principles, and I understand that they can't keep mouthing off, and it would put but at a certain point they have to say something. You know. The Rohingya crisis began in 2012, and they lost more rights from 2012 to 2017 than all the decades prior to that. And when you look in recent years, how much investment took place in the private sector dove in, and yet we weren't in there. We weren't allowed in. We weren't allowed to have an office, and I had to send people from Bangkok temporarily. But the UN knew what was going on in terms of the stripping of rights on this massive scale. And I sort of fear that we need to sort of again recalibrate in the way in which we approach these crises. And then on the money, I suspect that it's all very deliberate. It's not that the money doesn't exist, but I think they feel, because if our work goes to the heart of government legitimacy, it is human rights, but it's pure political power when exercised properly. And they fear it. They fear it. And so there's a very deliberate attempt to keep you in your station and not allow you to. So the treaty bodies suffer, special procedures suffer, and we just don't seem to have enough money to do the sorts of things that we need to really invest in. More training, more technical support, and more finding of amicus. I mean, the ones that we've done have been successful, but I wish we could do much more. So.
Other questions? Yes.
Should there be a binding treaty on business and human rights?
Yeah, I'm absolutely open to it. I mean, we don't want to see an exercise toward it which destroys the guiding principles that we have in place. But if we have an improvement upon it and builds upon it, yes, I'm quite happy to. I think we should be moving in that direction. But we just worried that I'm speaking as if I'm still High Commissioner. Oh, but we worried at the time that as the negotiations began, that this would disrupt and weaken the continued movement on the guiding principles, and so we didn't want to see one supplant the other when it wasn't. We didn't know what the final picture would look like. So, but completely open to it. Yeah.
completely open, but is this the next step of making multinationals the subject to the same legal duties as states? Or is it with states these days, it's difficult to have a binding treaty?
Whereas the power of states continues to decompose. I mean, in many countries, and we know this, you visit the country and it's a country in name only. The institutions don't work. You visit a particular minister, they have no authority outside of the four walls of the office. And we play theatre. We make it believe that there is a state with a functioning judiciary, functioning executive.
But Exxon and Facebook
and those
so much more powerful.
So much more powerful. So much more powerful. And if you continue to treat them as if they're outside of this particular orbit, then we'll continue to face problems.
Any further questions? Yes.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight to watch the conversation. My question relates to a potential solution to maintain the rules-based international system, which was for countries to exercise greater pressure on one another to comply with international law. What would you say are the pressure levers in an age when we have the rise of populist leaders who are self-serving and respond much more to the pressures of their country's populations than international pressures when it comes to states of compliance with norms, and where those populations tend to be generally stuck in economic crisis and struggling to survive, where human rights for them, right or wrong, it doesn't seem to be a priority when they're just trying to live. What would you say is there? Should countries be looking at different ways of exercising pressure on one another? And what would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've reached a stage where we've gone the maximum. So in certain conditions we have the application of non-coercive means or targeted sanctions on various leaders, and in the case of Burundi it didn't work, and the European Union sought out those particular particularly nasty characters who were going regularly on holidays to various European capitals and then putting asset freezes and travel bans on. But I still think that the public denunciation of practices, I mean, I'm trying to think through, because on the one hand, we've been trying it and it seems not to work. On the other hand, it seems to also work. And we haven't gone further, and we don't have allies doing it. I mean, let's take Venezuela. You had the famous Afuni case in 2012. The Working Group on Arbitrary Detention was very clear that there was contamination within the Venezuelan judiciary, a political contamination. And this particular case identified the political intervention by the executive. And so from that point on, the machinery of the human rights mechanisms began to speak about this. The only country that was saying anything was the United States, which didn't really help matters at the time. And then later Spain said one or two, they issued one or two statements. By the time I got to the office in 2014, we were really active on Venezuela. But there was no one else, no one in the region, no one in Europe saying anything. And now look at Venezuela. And so the argument that somehow, human rights don't matter, we know they matter. And we know that gross violations of human rights today are the conflicts of tomorrow. And you have very few now boundary disputes that flare up into open conflict. Eritrea and Ethiopia was the last one. And so most of it is connected to human rights deficits in country. And a willful neglect of it is outrageous, really. But what we don't have is the enormous pressure that needs to be, So we all say human rights are important, but then when juxtaposed, against the trading relationships, the commodity markets, security arrangements, sale of weapons. Then you have the gross hypocrisy and cowardice, and here we are. And so my suspicion is that if we could double down on at every turn, if we see something Kabila is doing we don't like, we double down. Myanmar, the same thing, where Poland, Hungary, where it is, we go even further than we've done before. And again, we know ultimately it's a losing proposition for them because the international media generally sides with the human rights community. And if you can leverage on that, then we could probably do better.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering what advice have you offered your successor, if any? Or would you offer your successor?
Flee when you have the chance.
Well, she herself has been tortured. Her father was killed by Pinochet.
The advice, was similar to what was said to me, and there were two pieces of advice: don't privilege any country or protect any group of countries. And in particular, the feeling was that you're going to come under pressure from the permanent five, and don't allow them to do that to you. And the other one was, at least I took it to heart, was you come out swinging. Because most of the discussions we have are private discussions with those officials of a particular country. They have to believe that if you threaten to go public, that you will do it. And no matter what they say or however they try and intimidate you, that you will go public. And I did this a number of times when a country would come and say to me, you will not talk about this. I would, and I would add to it. And every time they tried, I would do the same thing. And the belief was, at least I thought, that if you were credible enough, that they knew that you could go that distance, that just mention of a particular emblematic case, a law that had to be rewritten, redrafted, or whatever, that they would then take your view seriously. The idea that you can achieve, it's a nonsense, ridiculous sort of thing, that when people say, oh, you can achieve so much through diplomacy without going public. How? It's so ridiculous, it's so naive. And it can work if they believe you're capable enough, or you're capable of doing it, of going public. But again, I think we haven't gone the whole, we can do more on that scale.
I'll ask a last question, which is based, I think, Boris Nemtsov said, the only way of making Putin respect human rights is to stop his oligarch supporters sending their children to Eden. And it gave rise to a Magnitsky Law movement in which, using not international law, because we don't believe in international law, it's not binding, thanks to Trump and others, but it's national law. We use our sovereign powers, and I'm speaking of Canada and America and Europe, increasing number of European countries, to sanction human rights abusers by way of A, stopping them coming to the country, B, seizing their assets, C, stopping their children coming for schooling, and D, stopping their parents coming for medical treatment. And by way, because the people who make money out of human rights want to stay in the country that their conduct has emaciated, they want to use the casinos of the West and the banks of the West and so forth. And so this idea of national Magnitsky laws, named after a lawyer in Russia who was tortured and killed eventually in prison, is actually gaining some useful, these kinds of sanctions?
Undoubtedly in the short term, but is it not the case, Geoffrey, that in other contexts, with other governments, led by populist leaders who see human rights defenders and their communities as largely foreign agents funded by governments that are trying to undermine the control and political stranglehold they have a country in. Use similar means. In other words, you identify a credible mechanism which they then turn against the very people that you want to support.
Yes, Russia, after Obama admitted Magnitsky law, Putin had one. All those who the commanders who would have him obey were not allowed to invest in Russian banks. I don't think Duce for a moment wanted to, but yes, it can be used in a attack.
When we saw sort of the foreign agents law, I mean, that really comes from a root and used in another context.
At the moment, legal struggles are over the red notice of Interpol.
Yes.
It is sometimes granted to authoritarian regimes against dissidents for political reasons.
Yes. No, so I think in this playing of chess, we have to just think about, I mean, there's an appeal to it in the short term, but just think about the consequences longer term, and then maybe another way of doing it. But it's undoubtedly something that works in the short term, I think.
Zeid, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for being our associate. It is quite clear that law and lawyers are not enough for the international rule-based order. We've got to work with diplomats, historians, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you.